So we're going to get straight into it with an example of how VLOOKUP works versus XLOOKUP and the syntax that you'll need to use. So we're going to look up this value here, Suicide Squad, and we're going to try and return the box office gross in $1 million, which should be $325 million. To do a VLOOKUP, we type equals VLOOKUP, open our brackets, and then the lookup value will be here, the Suicide Squad, comma, and then we want the table array. So that's going to be both of these columns here. So F4 to G24, another comma, then our column index number, that's dead simple here. Title is column 1, and then box office gross is column 2. So we want column 2, then another comma, and it's going to ask us for our range lookup, which is actually a match type. True will give you an approximate match. That means if it can't find Suicide Squad, it will just get a closest value that it can find. We want an exact match, which is false, or you can just put a 0 to complete that and close the brackets. Hit enter and we get our 325. So XLOOKUP works in a very similar way, but with some subtle differences which are hugely important and beneficial to you. They won't be immediately obvious, but I'm going to step them through. To do an XLOOKUP, we type equals XLOOKUP in the same way as we did with the VLOOKUP. Our lookup value is exactly the same, so it's going to be Suicide Squad here. We put a comma. Now in lookup array, where previously we went for the whole table, we're just going to tell it where our lookup value is. So in this case, it is in this column here. Hit comma, and then it wants our return array. So this is the column that we want to return. So that would be this one here. If we then hit a comma, we then go on to an if not found. Now I'll come back to that later. Hit a comma again, and we get match mode. We'll put 0 again, and that will give us our exact match. Hit another comma, and then we're asked for this search mode thing. Again, we're going to ignore that for now and hit close brackets. Hit enter, we've got our $325 million. With VLOOKUP, you can only read from left to right, meaning that your column that you're looking up from, in our case title, has to be the leftmost column in your data, so you can then count to the right to get a column index of the one that you want to return. In our case, title is not the leftmost column, so we would have to either take a copy or move that column, neither of which are preferable ways of working, and they start to mess your data up, causing duplicates and all sorts of other things. I've added one in there anyway though, just to prove the point. We've now got to change our range. So our lookup value stays the same, I5, where we've got Suicide Squad. Our range now wants to be starting in this column here and going all the way across to studio here. So we can just highlight over this range here, pick this lot, drop it down. And then instead of column 2, we've got to work out which column it is. So VLOOKUP is the first column, release year the second, and studio the third. So we've got to change that as well. Change that to a 3, hit enter, and that gets us to Warner Brothers. So much easier with XLOOKUP because you can just target your column. If we add a column in here, right click and insert and just call it test, we can see that our VLOOKUP has broken, but our XLOOKUP is still working. That is because in the VLOOKUP, it's actually expanded the range to include all 4 columns, but the column index of 3 has stayed the same. So now it's looking for the third column from VLOOKUP, which is test, and it has a blank value. The XLOOKUP, because we pointed specifically at G and at F as our ranges, they've been retained, and therefore it's still working. So if I type something in our lookup value that doesn't exist in the table, then both of them will break. And that is because there's no error handling on it. Now to add some error handling to VLOOKUP, we'd have to do something like this. So if error, so if the VLOOKUP statement or formula results in an error, then we want to put a comma, and then we want to maybe type something like not found and close it with the speech marks and a bracket, hit enter, and now we get not found. But equally, if we typed Suicide Squad back in there, it will come back. So let's go back to test. With XLOOKUP, error handling is built in. Now we didn't use it earlier when we first built it, but there was this gap here where it asked for an if not found. All you've got to do in there is just type whatever you want to put if it doesn't find a value, and that becomes part of the statement. So we're not adding additional complication around it as we've had to with the VLOOKUP. Hit enter and we get our not found, a much easier way of dealing with errors. So when you're building either of these formulas, it's dead easy to forget to put the exact match in with this 0 on the end. So if you didn't put that in at all, and hit enter on the VLOOKUP and do the same on here, we'll just take that exact match out. Now, if we change the lookup value here to something that it doesn't recognize, you'll see that the VLOOKUP is still working. And that is because in a VLOOKUP, it defaults to an approximate match, where the XLOOKUP defaults to an exact match. In 99 times out of 100, you want an exact match. And if it's not there, you want it to error. That is not what VLOOKUP does, and that can be really confusing if you've forgotten it, because sometimes it returns the wrong value. Where XLOOKUP really delivers the knockout blow over VLOOKUP is when you come to bigger data sets like this. So in this example here, if we were looking up versus title again and using a VLOOKUP, this would be our first column, meaning we could only pull back these two columns here. Now, even if we added our column over here as a duplicate, and you don't really want duplicates in your data, you want to store everything once for reducing size and efficiency. But let's say we did, and we wanted to pull any of these columns to the right. We've then got to treat this as column 1. And then we've got to work out 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which column is referenced to that first column. And that can be really difficult even here with a few columns like 10 or 12. Imagine if you've got 100 columns, you've got to work across to work out which column you want to pull back. And then if we add a column, it all goes wrong, as we showed you earlier. What people do to try and get around this is they put reference numbers in the top, and that helps them decide which column it is. So you might start 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way along the top, but it's just unnecessary faff that we don't need to put in. With XLOOKUP, you can just direct point to a column that you want to pull back, point to the column that you want to look up against, and it will just give you the value. Let's do one. So if we go equals XLOOKUP in here, look up our Suicide Squad value, comma, we want to look it up in an array which is title, so column K, comma, then we want to pull back a column. Now we can pick any of these at all. So let's pick our IMDb rating, column F, comma, and then it's going to ask us for if not found. Let's put in not found, and then comma, match mode. Now we know from earlier that we could just leave that blank and it will default to an exact match. That's exactly what we want. Or we can put our 0 in to just define it as an exact match. Next bit is our search mode. Now that means it's going to search the data from top to bottom or from bottom up and some other things. Don't worry too much about that. In most cases, top to bottom is what you need, so just leave it blank as that's the default. Close your brackets, hit enter, and we get 6.1. So that's the IMDb rating for Suicide Squad. And if we go back into here, we might want to pick genre, so column D. It's as easy as changing this F to a D, and then we get action, which is the genre of that movie. If you wanted to do that in VLOOKUP, you've got to go back to your columns and start counting again and take your socks off and all that sort of stuff. This is much easier. XLOOKUP is the way forward. Am I saying that VLOOKUP has no value and is completely redundant? Yes, in most cases. There is one case I can think of where I would use it, and that is a VLOOKUP match. And I'm going to do a video on that next.